Alright, I've got another game by Alekhine, who versed Morrison in 1944, that shows the swift and powerful use of a knight on an outpost. This is extremely interesting. Alekhine is white. It opens with the king pawn. Morrison responds with the king pawn. Alekhine brings a knight to c3. Morrison brings his bishop out. Alekhine matches his bishop up to Morrison's. You can see again, as usual, that the grandmasters are competing for influence, if not outright possession, of the central section of the board. This is a pattern in all of their games. Morrison brings his knight in front of his bishop. Alekhine centralizes the pawn, strengthens the central pawn, opening the lane for his other C bishop, his dark squared bishop. Morrison brings out the knight. Alekhine brings his queen all the way up to h5. A very swift opening with the queen. Morrison castles, putting his king in safety, which is wise. Now Alekhine brings his bishop up to g5, and you're starting to see something very interesting and swift happening here. Alekhine is absolutely on the attack immediately. So Morrison brings his queen over to e8. Alekhine brings his knight up to f3. Morrison brings his knight as a defensive measure up to g3. And now comes the interesting play. Alekhine has this pawn chain. This pawn gives this knight the outpost. The two powers here are blockading this pawn so that it cannot come up to c6 to threaten that knight. And of course, this is the weak square. d5 is the weak square because Morrison has already pushed his pawn to e5. So there's nobody to chase that knight away. That knight, for the next several moves, has a very permanent home. And you can just see the lines of attack that Alekhine has already with his central place powers and that magnificent knight on that outpost. He puts it right in the center of battle. Morrison pulls his bishop back here to b6. And Alekhine immediately makes use of this magnificent knight outpost and pops it right there on f6. And it leaves you agog. You go, oh, whoa, what the heck? Check to the king already. And you say, well, that's silly because Alekhine just gave him a knight. You can simply take it with the pawn. Yes, you can. You can take that knight with the pawn. And now Alekhine shows you the brutal and swift response. He simply sacrifices the knight for the winning game. The game is over at this point. He retakes the pawn with the bishop. And there is nothing Morrison can do to prevent checkmate. Is that astonishing or what? I mean, that is so typical of Alekhine. The next move, of course, no matter what Morrison does, what is he going to do? You know, his pawn here is blockaded. His knight does absolutely nothing. This is obviously the Alekhine target. With his, he can either come here to h6 and then over here for the checkmate, or he can bring his other knight up to g5 and take that pawn next move and go checkmate. There's absolutely nothing Morrison can do to prevent this. That is an incredibly beautiful and powerful illustration, in my opinion, of when you get a central knight in the outpost, you already have access to the king. So if your opponent is setting up the pawns and beginning to move the knights into the center of the board like that, attacking the center and posting knight outposts, you had better pay attention because something is going on. Now I have another really excellent game by Alekhine and Nimzovich that I want to show you, showing how he utilized knight outposts. This was a game that Nimzovich played in London in 1927. Nimzovich was black. It was at the Tournament of London. His opponent opened with the king pawn. Nimzovich brings the king pawn up. They're opening up along central lines again. Nimzovich is claiming the center. He's at least fighting for the center, which was one of the central pillars of his system, which is the central pillar in any chess play. You must approach the center, influence the center, because it is in the center that all power radiates. His opponent takes the central pawn, attacking his knight and the pawn. Nimzovich says that's okay. I will exchange the pawns. Now you see the knight has that square covered as well. His opponent does a central pawn thrust with the queen pawn. It's a very interesting battle for the center. Every game you play with Alekhine and Nimzovich, he was constantly contesting the center and screaming about making sure the center was controlled. This preventative move prevents his knight from moving over here to b4. Always wise to restrict your opponent's knights if you can. That's what Nimzovich talks about constantly. That's what Alekhine talks about. It's a very important concept. His opponent fianchettos the bishop, which is a good general developing move because it gives him this long, beautiful diagonal across the middle of the board. Nimzovich castles queenside. His opponent brings his knight in front of the king, and now Alekhine Nimzovich does something real interesting. He makes an odd knight move, and he explains this in his notes. He's saying this is not in the spirit of a typical opening maneuver, but he is trying to overprotect this pawn. Overprotection of a key point or a key piece is one of Nimzovich's pillars in his system. He says, by moving this knight, I am protecting this pawn. I don't want that pawn to be exchanged. The pawn here is already gone. The only pawn that can possibly force an exchange will be the c pawn, and it'll take 2 more moves to get there. But Nimzovich makes sure that he keeps that pawn above all else. And of course, his opponent is going to challenge that pawn right now immediately. He says, well, I'm not going to let you get away with that. Nimzovich develops his knight to protect that pawn so that you can see the battle for this pawn beginning to take place. That pawn, one little pawn on one little square, the d5 square, is the key to this entire game. Nimzovich was known for this. He loves to bring out overprotection of pieces or of squares. And his opponent brings up the h3 pawn, preventing Nimzovich from bringing his knight out. Again, it's a preventative move. Nimzovich brings that over. He's got his double knights over here. He's giving up fighting for this pawn. He sees he can't take that pawn out, so he moves his knight back over, and Nimzovich brings his knight already on the outpost. And you can see the influence of that knight radiating into the enemy camp. He's past the middle part of the board. He's into enemy territory. That knight right now is superior to either one of these bishops. Even though this bishop has a long diagonal, it stops short with that outpost. One of the only ways that his opponent is going to have to open up this lane is exchange that knight, and then he loses the influence of his bishop. That knight is better than that bishop in this position at this point in time. So his opponent brings a developing move. Nimzovich utilizes this concept of having this knight here to get rid of one of the attackers of this pawn. He exchanges the knight. Gladly so, he said, because he wants this central pawn. Doubles up the opponent's pawns, and now he immediately brings his other knight into action. And this knight answers the call. He's threatening the knight. He's thinking, well, let's swap knights then. It's time to exchange the knights. Nimzovich has different things in mind. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. He pulls his bishop back. His opponent brings his queen up in front of the king. Nimzovich takes his knight over here to the rim. Now, can you see what he's doing here? He's not going to leave his knight on the rim where it has much less power and influence. He's getting to somewhere. The knight has to take a journey. For all intents and purposes, the center is essentially closed with pawns. It has central pawns, so it's safe to make this kind of a knight journey. Can you see the square where that knight is heading? Yes, you can. Right there, c4. That is another knight outpost. His opponent, apparently not recognizing what Nimzovich is doing, presses the pawn on h. Nimzovich builds up this center pawn now. He wants that pawn there. That pawn is key to the game. So he builds his pawn chain. He takes a moment to do that. His opponent castles. Nimzovich brings his bishop up, bringing in the long diagonal there. He's got centralized bishops, which is extremely good. He's got a knight heading for an outpost, and his opponent realizes, I have to come back over here at this point in time because Nimzovich is building up something here going on really, really strong. I mean, if he presses his bishop and swaps bishops and then drops his queen here, that's serious, you know. He's got to find a way to prevent what Nimzovich is doing, and Nimzovich comes over here to another outpost with his bishop threatening the queen. So you can see the power of outposts here. The only way to technically not get into a strictly defensive mode is to guard the queen with the bishop. And now Nimzovich grabs the open file on the rook. So he's coming at the queen with two diagonals, and he pins this bishop to the queen. This is a powerful setup because based on the knight outpost. Now, of course, his opponent has to swap the bishops. There is no question the bishop has to go. There was too much of a thrust with the bishops. Too much power there. Drops his queen back down to d1. And now Aaron Nimzovich takes advantage of another outpost. Now his knight jumping from the rim where it was doing next to nothing, but because it made its journey here, now it really is cramping his opponent. That knight outpost is sensational. That knight is vastly superior to this knight. He is in the enemy territory. He has an outpost. He is radiating influence all throughout the queenside. Aaron Nimzovich has a screaming game going here. Notice Morrison places his bishop with an outpost, thus influencing a diagonal heading straight for the king. Nimzovich puts his bishop on f4. No, he doesn't. I'm sorry. He brought his bishop up to here, to f4, challenging Nimzovich's bishop. Of course, that makes better sense. And now the bishops exchange. He exchanges with the knight. His opponent is trying to get the knight into this game because he sees the superiority of Nimzovich's knight. And so he says, I have to have this knight battle. I have to strengthen my knight. Now, what do you do in this case? What is the classic Steinitz rule that I've mentioned several times? Chase away the knight. In this case, Morrison can't chase away Nimzovich's knight. That's the weak square. This pawn is already pushed, and this pawn is gone. There is no pawn to come up to this b3 square and challenge that knight. But Nimzovich has a pawn that will challenge the white knight, and he pushes it. You notice the double pawns here are not a weakness. You notice they are a strength. They are an absolute vital part of this game because he is chasing the knight away. Now, of course, the pawn is going to take the pawn because he wants to keep his knight right there. In the process, Nimzovich now has an open file here. A direct lane to the king because of that pawn push threatening the knight, and then his pawn exchanges. So he gives up a pawn to gain an open file. This is superb chess. This is powerful chess. Nimzovich, of course, is going to bring his queen right to here. Again, a centralizing move, radiating power toward the king. Morrison has to drop his knight down to g2 to protect his king because he can see the attack is coming on really strong right now. Nimzovich, of course, simply takes the pawn. He says, well, I've got this pawn now. And his opponent pushes the pawn thrust to challenge the queen, of course, because he can't let the queen stay on this side. If the queen gets over in this angle, he's got a heck of an open file with which to attack his opponent. So he's got to chase the queen away. Whoop, I'm getting ahead of the game. Unfortunately, he chases it right to the open file. Now Nimzovich has a queen backed up by a rook into the open file of the king. This guy's in trouble. So, he pulls his king up here to f2 to avoid that open file attack, and he connects his base file here so that he's got a good counterattacking chance against Nimzovich's threats here. Nimzovich brings his knight back up to here to d6. And you're asking, wait a minute, he had the outpost. Why is he abandoning the outpost? Because he's putting it on a better outpost. He says that in his notes, which is extremely interesting. His opponent puts his knight on an outpost on h4, and what it is doing is essentially blocking the file from Nimzovich's being able to use it. So Nimzovich's response is very simple. He brings this knight right back into the game again on this outpost. Instead of this c4, he puts it on e4, thus putting the king in check and having a great kingside attack because of the outpost. It was at this point that his opponent resigned. And you ask why? If the king goes to here, Nimzovich says, simply take the pawn with the knight. And the game is over. This illustrates the beauty and power of the knight outposts and how the knight outposts can coordinate a central attack with a wing attack to put influence against the king. It's an absolutely sensational way to play chess when you know how to develop an outpost with your pawns as the base and then utilize that outpost with your knights to get into enemy territory. When you can do that, you're starting to improve your chess. Definitely. Now this next game is a game that I recently played where I take away the influence and power of his knights from his outposts, either by exchanging them or chasing his knights away. And because I was able to do this, I was able to thrust through the center and have a very powerful attack. I'm playing white. I open with the queen pawn opening. He brings out his knight immediately, which is a good, that's fine. I do the queen gambit pawn opening. He's doing the Neo Grunfeld. I'll pull out my knight. This is a typical Grunfeld defense where he fianchettos his bishop to give him that long diagonal influence on the queen side. I go ahead and thrust another central pawn. Now when your opponent or when yourself, when you bring in 3 central pawns like that, you're challenging your opponent. You're saying, I have such good power in the center that I'm going to mow you over. You have to prove to me my center pawns are not strong enough to do that. So that's the idea here in this game. He tries to bring his knights into influence on outposts to establish the idea that he's going to attack my strong center. I'm bringing up my bishop to centralize my power and to emphasize the power of my pawns. At this point you can see I've got a little bit more space. I've got a huge center thrust. He's bringing out his knights to challenge my dominance of the center at this point, because development is a temporary imbalance, as Silman correctly states. I go ahead and push this pawn one more time, challenging his knight. I'm well aware he's got the attack on that pawn, but I have 2 pawns here supporting it, plus my knight. My bishop is very, very bad at this point in time. Yes, it is supporting my 2 central pawns, however. So I can live at this point with that bad bishop. He brings his knight to here, to a post, an outpost. At this point, on the 4th rank, a knight is equal to a bishop. It's when it gets to the 5th rank that it becomes better than a bishop, and on the 6th rank is its absolute power point. That's where you want to get your knights. But he's got his knight posted on this point. So it was at this time I chose to castle. Get your king in safety. It's very important too. He brings his bishop out to g4, pinning my knight to my queen. I brought my other bishop up, again coming into the center, so you can see it's quite a battle for the center. At this point he does exchange my knight. And I say that's okay at this point in time, I can live with that. He does disrupt my king side a little bit. He opens up the lane on G for me, or for him. He brings his queen up because, of course, he's got this beautiful diagonal coming at me. I go ahead and push my F pawn, again chasing his knight from that outpost. I still have a center thrust coming up. Now I've got 4 pawns in the center threatening his knight. He has to move his knight again over here to g4, which is fine by me. I decided I have territory. I have a central thrust. I'm chasing his knights. I'm going to keep pushing forward here. I have a huge amount of territory. I'm cramping my opponent. I have a lot more room than he does. So in a cramped position like my opponent is in, the best thing you can do is exchange pieces, which he promptly does. He goes ahead and exchanges my good bishop. He got my good bishop, which at this point was okay. And now I have pawns all over in the center. However, my king is dangerously open. There's not a lot of attack coming at my king just yet, but I have to hurry because my king is dangerously open. He's completely obliterated my fortress, and I've put all my pawns up here in the center, so I have to hurry up with an attack here. His king is very nice and enclosed. Mine is not. This is not a good way to have your king if you can help it. So, again, I push my central pawn into a central pawn thrust, threatening his queen, the queen pawn, the bishop pawn, no, the queen pawn and the knight, again attacking the knights, making them uncomfortable. And what he does is he comes down here, takes a pawn, and puts me in check. So I move my king out of check. You have to move your king out of check. Duh. Now he takes this pawn that was threatening his knight. Can you see what I'm going to do next? I have to hurry. I have to hurry because I don't have a good king structure at this point. I'm kind of in trouble for the end game here. So I have to hustle. I went ahead and took his G6 pawn. I decided, okay, I've got to start finding some weaknesses. And if I can't find some weaknesses, I have to create some weaknesses. He exchanges it with his F pawn. F7 takes G6. Now I bring my queen up behind my bishop, giving me this angle of attack. I have the open file coming toward the king. So I've disrupted his king side a little bit at this point. He recognizes this and comes up to help guard this pawn. Because he knows if he doesn't guard this pawn, I am going to sacrifice my bishop to get to his king. I will gladly give him that bishop, bring my queen up here, and have my queen up here if he doesn't do something about it. So he pushes his king to protect his queen. So I need to get rid of this bishop. I'm going to lose the exchange on purpose. My other rook over here isn't doing anything. This bishop is guarding this square to my beautiful open file, getting to my king, to his king. So I'm going to sacrifice the exchange here. I'm going to move my rook over. He's going to take my rook with his bishop. And I'm going to take his bishop with my other rook. Now I've gotten rid of his important dark squared bishop, and I have the open file, and I have the diagonal for attack. I do believe I've got things under enough control that I can take him. He pushes the A pawn. Why, I don't know. I go ahead and sacrifice the bishop. I say absolutely, I'm coming in with the bishop, no question. Now, he can't take that pawn. Or he can't take that bishop with the pawn. It's not going to do him a bit of good because I've got the queen coming up that's going to be supported, and I'm going to checkmate him. So, the only thing he can do is move his king out of check. At this point, we have a discovered check on his king when I move the bishop out. And I move the bishop out, threatening his queen. He's going to lose his queen because I've got him in check. He has to move out of check. He moves here to H6. And I'm thinking, you know, I can keep the initiative and momentum going. I don't have to take the queen right now at this moment. I can, and I'll have a better chance in the end game. But my end game is going to be extremely difficult because of my pawn structure, which is virtually non-existent on the side where my king is. And I recognize that. So, I'm going to keep putting him in check and bring my queen into it. Check. The only square he can go to at this point is further out in the open. You notice how because I was willing to use my pawn structure to weaken his king side and then to sacrifice a piece to open up the king side more, I've chased his king out into the open here. My next move is obvious. Checkmate. And I still have his queen and price. That's a fun little game for me personally. I was thrilled to play it because it shows the power of a centralization and you chasing the knights around, getting rid of his knights, making sure his knights don't have a lot of influence. When you do that, you can improve your game using your minor pieces. That was a fun little game for me. Thanks for watching. I'll have more games. I've played a couple of other games that I really do want to illustrate in some other videos, and I've also found a couple other really interesting Grandmaster games further exploring the way to build your board so that you can translate and decipher the board so that you can utilize your knights as opposed to your opponent's knights being stronger than yours or making your opponent's bishops weaker than your knights. The battle with the minor pieces is very often decided when you can make your minor pieces superior. So happy checkmating, and I'll see you in the next videos.